recording to this computer and taking this live on Facebook. Here.
I may see if I can get this curtain down so we're not getting quite as much.
Okay,
light.
sure, we have a moment. That's fine. Go for it. All right. Okay, almost ready. Another moment, should be good. And all right, and here we are. Welcome everyone to our final of 3 dialogues in the Cosmic Campfire Book Club. It has been quite a journey here this last month or so. And before I introduce our guest today, I want to let y'all know that we have now put on super early bird tickets for the Cosmic Campfire physical gathering, rekindling humanity's biggest questions. So if you've enjoyed these dialogues talking about the intersection of science, spirituality, cosmology, and theology, you're going to love to spend 3 days with us February 1st through 3rd in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So for the rest of this week, only for folks who are in the book club, we have $99 early bird tickets on sale. If you look in the link of the show notes right now on the Facebook Live, you'll see a link for that. So we'd love to see you in person so we can have these conversations with each other and not just online. So with that, I want to introduce you to our guest today, the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Bourgeault. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Pleasure, Mike.
For those of you who are not familiar, Cynthia Bourgeault is I consider a pioneer of the intersection of centering prayer and how it impacts every aspect of life. A little bit about her story. She grew up in a Christian Science church home while also being raised in a Quaker school. And somehow that tension and that alchemy worked her way into adulthood as she became a professional medievalist, an Episcopal priest, someone who, in my perception, has unprecedented access to the old order monastic life and a lot of influence in recent decades on how certain monasteries approach their life. But she brings those treasures out of the monastery and into the streets. And Cynthia's work has been deeply impactful on my own spiritual journey and everyday practice for the last dozen or so years. So I'm personally really honored to have her here today. And first of all, we're going to talk about her essay, of course, in How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere. And if you've been reading along with the essays and you've been following along with our dialogues with a number of the authors, you'll notice a common thread of folks moving from the sort of distant old man in the sky vision of God, which they either disbelieved in or never believed in to begin with, and they moved into a more panentheistic appreciation of God. And if you've read Cynthia's essay, you'll know that she strikes a little bit of a dissonant chord with that neat narrative from sort of theism to panentheism. I want to read a little bit from her essay in case you haven't read it or you want a refresher. She says, "I have to admit, I did not take easily to being called a panentheist. Yes, I know that Marcus Borg and most of my other theologically progressive colleagues are all in favor of it, but the term has always made me distinctly uncomfortable. It's not so much the concept that bothers me, it's the word itself. Like a jet airplane, it's one of those terms that tries to define itself in terms of a prior term, in this case pantheism, to which it offers an ostensible improvement. Panentheism hence looks like a more refined version of pantheism, an update that disposes of its major shortcomings while still implicitly keeping the paradigm in place. But in fact, it's the entire paradigm that's the problem in the first place. And I suspect that things are not going to improve, either for our schools of theology or our planet, until we gird up our loins and stop enabling it. I could go on, but I'll pause there. This essay was specifically discussed for those of you who are also Homebrewed Christianity listeners with the editors, Philip Clayton and Andrew Davis. And Philip seemed distinctly uncomfortable with certain aspects of this. So Cynthia, how would you address that and elaborate on your discomfort with this term, panentheism?
Well, I think the problem with the term is it really lets you have your cake and eat it too. It keeps the old order model that we've had ever since the days of the Old Testament of God out there and other in nature, and creation of a fundamentally different order and substance of God. And all it does is provide a little place where God can touch down and inhabit the creation without getting lost in it. And I think that really is just sort of throwing a fish to an old paradigm, which is the problem in the first place, that of course, if we look at things from the point of view of modern science, the word pantheism is going to come way, 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 way closer to describing the actual state of what we see, that God is co-inhabiting and indwelling in everything. But that's not because we're worshiping little statues and rivers and things like that, but because there is no top-down God on the top who's above and different from everything else. The whole thing is God. There's no place in any universe, created or uncreated, that you can go that is not God, and every part of it is the beingness of God working it out. So I'm not at all in favor of maintaining this artificial dichotomy between creator and created, which is only a convention of a few of the orders and a function of a very, I would say, semi-mature level of human consciousness. It shows itself to me to be a sort of red flag which tells you you're dealing out of mental, rational, or egoic consciousness. And that as long as you're using that consciousness, you're never going to solve the problem. But as soon as you get rid of a consciousness that depends on separation and differentiation in order to create identity, the problem disappears. So I think Panikkar actually had that idea, and he proposed that rather than sort of going back and forth and using panentheism, which is a kind of, slightly readjusting and nuancing while keeping an old, flawed paradigm in place, we just use a whole new one, which he called cosmotheandric, which meant that we learned to think in terms of a circulation amongst the realms, the orders of being, the worlds, the created, the uncreated, and that entire circulation is God. Barbara Brown Taylor was talking about that in her wonderful book, The Luminous Webs, years ago, where she says that God is not the author of the picture, God is the picture, is the unity, the spaces, the gaps, the things that make the whole thing work. And until we start thinking that way and stop thinking, even out of deep respect to our Judeo-Christian monotheistic roots, of a God out there, we're only just looking at our own eyeballs when we do that. And until we stop doing that and really genuinely graduate to a new level of consciousness, that whole separation consciousness is going to continue to keep doing us in.
Wow. Okay. So you've said a lot here. Want to pause here for a moment and think about it. So we have folks coming from a variety of different places as they come to this group. And some of them are coming from, a post-theistic place where even seeing an idea of the transcendent or the sacred in reality feels like a bridge too far. But on the other hand, we have folks coming from, a more traditional perspective. And what you just said about we ought to perhaps move beyond monotheism might strike them as shocking. So could you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by moving beyond monotheism?
Well, I can tell you a story that's it's actually a private story, maybe airing for the first time in semi-public here. But I went to pay a visit. I can tell you a story that's to Raymond Panikar. Probably about 6 months before his death, this old, wizened, 93-year-old wise man in his little home in Tavertet, Spain. And I've been reading and very, very carefully studying his book, Christophany. And I said, if I get your drift, Raymond, am I catching it right that what you're saying is that Jesus is not a monotheist? And he just smiled at me and said, yes, you have it. And said that in point of fact, that was the reason why they crucified him. Because he was not observing the proper distance creaturely between creator and created. He was standing too close. And, when Paul had to resolve that problem, Paul did it by doing a special end run and making Jesus a special case. Well, he was the only son of God. The rest of us are adopted. Another early run up on maintaining God as transcendent other and Jesus is, and the rest of us is, created order. And Panikar said Jesus spotted the loop in that. And Panikar didn't say this exactly, but having looked back on that from a perspective of really thinking about that conversation for nearly a decade now, I think what Panikar was implicitly recognizing was that Jesus was coming from a whole different place of consciousness. It wasn't like he was the only son of God and therefore he had the right to stand too close to God. It was because his way of thinking about it, which is the first case of fully mature non-dual consciousness we saw in the Western world, was just too devastating for the people around him, and too too hot to handle even to this day. And so they ultimately couldn't reconcile the clash in the portrayal of God between the Old Testament and the Jesus vision of it. And so they solved it by keeping Jesus a special case. But the way they should have solved it was by simply moving to his level of consciousness. So Panikar is one of the first to sort of imply that this insistence, this whole hoary tradition of Western monotheism is really a function of a level of human consciousness, what you might call the mental, rational, and up to the integral, but it falls short of genuinely non-dual levels of perception. Now, I don't know how to deal with that with people that like traditional religion. I love traditional religion. And, it doesn't bother me a bit to go into an Episcopal church and pick up even an old prayer book and worship God using this language, this symbol structure, reading the Psalms that talk about God high above the earth. It doesn't bother me because it's a form. It's a beautiful, beautiful form in which we can approach God. Richard Rohr says so beautifully that if something is infinite, it doesn't mean it's undescribable. It means it's infinitely describable. And so I think the construction of finitude, the construction of creator-creature distinction is a beautiful construction. And it allows us to look into the eyes of our story and pull forth from that story some beautiful facets of the relationality of our relationship with the divine source, with the whole. It's a beautiful metaphor. And I'm not at all suggesting we trash it and replace it with some sort of fuzzy non-dual stuff that gives us nobody to worship and no humility. It's a beautiful construction. It's not false. It doesn't need to be replaced, and it doesn't need to be disbelieved.
Mm.
It's just that you need to complement every construction, every frame. You have to have the humility to realize, as Meister Eckhart said, that there's no being without a mode of being. We can't look at anything without looking at it through a frame. But having looked at it through the frame, we have to own the frame, and we have to realize that the frames allow us to see through a glass darkly, and not run around defending and entitling and mistaking the frame for the actual vision. So, I have no complaints. I love the old creation God. I know what it does emotionally, what it does pietistically and theologically, all for it. But it's not the only game in town. It's a game particularly appropriate to a certain level of human consciousness and human functioning, a level that Jesus was already, quote, calling the question on. Mm-hmm. And until we've got the courage to stand up and just admit that, we're going to keep selling people a religion which is like a theme park. It's like a little Disneyland where we go on cool rides, but it doesn't match the expanse of the known universe.
Oh my goodness, I think that we're experiencing the limit of theme park religion right now in our current cultural moment in American Christianity, where the values of Jesus, even on the most exoteric level, say the Sermon on the Mount, seem to not be being reached. And in a moment, when we talk about your collection of essays, we could maybe dive into that. But right now, I want to highlight what you said about your love for the traditional language at the same time that you hold it lightly. And I think in Panikar, when you were originally maybe coming to some of these insights or solidifying some of these insights, you were reading something in Christophany, a section called The Mysticism of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And you say something here that I thought was intriguing. I was floored by what Panikar seemed to be arguing, that the Trinity, often dismissed as a theological add-on hammered out in the later theological councils, was actually an original, because it originated in the mind of Christ. It encapsulates in a single elegant mandala the entire personal experience of Jesus himself in his relationship to divinity. Far from either a static immanence or a static transcendence, Jesus' experience of God was cosmotheandric, the infinite and the finite continually interabiding one another, dynamically changing places through a process of continuing self-giving or kenosis. At the Abba Father pole, claims Panikar, Jesus is most fully identified with his finite selfhood, reaching out to God with what Panikar describes as a very intense experience of divine affiliation. At the opposite pole, I and the Father are one, there is simply a unity of being, no place where God stops and I begin. And between these two poles, the third of Jesus' three great, and I might be mispronouncing this, but Mahagavayani, or Master Sayings.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. It is good that I leave. This statement of Jesus places the other two in a perpetual canonic dynamism with which Panikar beautifully summarizes as, I am one with the source, as I too act as a source. By making all I have flowed receive again.
It's received, flow again.
I think there might be a little typo in the editorial thing here.
All I have received, flow again is how it should go.
Oh, yes. Okay. That makes even more sense. So what you seem to be picking up from Panikar here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the model of Trinity might actually be more mapping to this experiential interabiding than the language of either monotheism or panentheism.
Exactly. You've got it right on the nail, right on the head there. And that's why the cosmotheandric, that's why it's an intercirculation, and why the Trinity is so powerfully representative of that. Because it talks about the whole thing simply flowing, and the energy of love, the energy of identity comes out of the entire relational field, not out of any particular component part of it.
Wow. Okay. So that, yeah, that would be a shift. And for those who are Jesus followers, who are in the Christian tradition, it sounds like this understanding of the Trinity, perhaps from an elevated level of consciousness, could be a way that we can remain faithful to our tradition while also fully embracing the expanse of what science teaches us, what quantum physics teaches us about interbeing, and maybe even loving each other better, huh?
I think so, and I think that's why people like Elia Delio and and Richard Rohr have certainly jumped on the Trinity as seeing it not only as a better map of the mind of Christ, which completely inruns this whole panentheism thing, but also as something that we can talk about very, very congruently in terms of contemporary physics and understandings of the quantum world and the cosmological world, information exchange, non-localized action within a field. It's a kind of image, and the Trinity will go the distance in this kind of metaphoric usage and actually establishes a far more dynamic and reciprocal relationship with the language of modern science than the old version of the completely distant and distinct God in the sky who created all the rest of the stuff, which just does not connect with any of the models we're using nowadays to talk about, what we understand of the cosmos.
Hmm. Yes. And it's clear to me that you've arrived to these conclusions not only from reading, not only from study, although you certainly do that, but you keep referring to this this other frame of reference, this other form of consciousness. If someone's watching this and we're wanting to embody that kind of consciousness more on like a really practical level, what is a practice that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, you started talking in your intro about centering prayer. I think that for most people, the rubber hits the road when you seriously take up a meditation practice. Centering prayer is the one that, for various reasons, that I teach because it works so congruently with Christian theology and with my own Christian experience. But any meditation practice will force your whole being identity, and the hardwiring of your brain and brain heart to shift. And as that shifts, you begin to realize that what you thought were the stable givens of this world were just the conventions of your perceptual field. So I would say stabilizing meditation is a very, very good starting point. And then just simply reading and getting up to speed and some of the maps of the levels of consciousness that are being used nowadays out there in the world, everything from Wilber to spiral dynamics, then they will gateway you into some of the classic ones, so that Westerners are not even really fully on board yet with what levels of consciousness means, because it hasn't figured prominently or even at all in classic typologies of the spiritual journey. So people are scrambling. Nobody knows what non-dual means. Nobody knows what Christ consciousness means. We haven't thought that way. We've thought purgative, illuminative, unitive. But as we begin to get increasingly good brain science, we're beginning to understand how much there is a very, very reciprocal bootstrapping feedback loop between the mechanisms of perception, the parts of the brain we use, and what we actually see. And that until we take this seriously, we're not going to get out of our own hamster cage.
Yes, and I certainly find that to be true in my own experience. And toward the end of our talk today, we'll talk about a way that people could very seriously begin or enrich a contemplative practice, a centering prayer practice, even in their own homes with a course that you have created. But before we go fully there, though, I wanted to highlight something that you just said about. Oh yes, so a couple years ago, you and I did an interview. I think it was with something that Kurt Johnson was doing, and it was about church life more collectively. a number of folks in this group are ministers. So they're not only seeking growth for themselves, but they're wondering about growth for their congregations. And you said something in this interview a couple years ago that surprised me. My paraphrase of it would be that you wouldn't immediately jump when you're thinking of a congregation-wide renewal to esoteric practices, but you would actually look at strengthening certain elements of exoteric with an X, exoteric practices, collective practices, outer practices for the renewal of the church. Does this ring a bell?
Well, you may have to fill in a little bit more.
It was a brief statement, and it might be unfair to ask you to elaborate on it now a couple years later, but it seemed as though you were suggesting some other additional practical ways in which faith leaders could help prepare their congregations on a more mundane level of awareness for the practice and the gift of centering prayer.
For the gift of centering prayer, or for the gift of renewal?
Well, the gift of renewal, I imagine that you think, and I do, that everyone would benefit from a contemplative practice. And the reality is that a lot of folks aren't there yet, or that it's a seasonal thing. When we have small children, for instance, it can be really challenging to commit to a daily practice. So I guess in your years, even as a medievalist, and I know you've done some work around chant, for instance, as a collective practice, are there any external practices that you might recommend to ministers to implement in their congregational life alongside offering centering prayer groups and things like that?
Well, I don't like the way that whole question is framed, Mike, because it starts out with thinking the way most people do out in the lay world now, as practices consisting of practices. And we have chant, and we have Lectio Divina, and we have centering prayer, and we have Bible study. And it doesn't work that way. It's not a bunch of little things like a laundry line. It's a deepening wisdom appropriation of things. And the problem with introducing what people experience as esoteric practice is that they think it means that they're going to get secret information. That's again a level of their consciousness to think that knowledge is information. But there is absolutely nothing esoteric about centering prayer. It's a fundamental basic discipline, and that keeping silence, I first learned it with the Quakers when I was 5 years old. No big deal. Mm-hmm. I think we have to get over being so frightened of it, as if it falls off into some sort of altered state of consciousness divide that people are scared to go into. It's perfectly natural. It's a function of the human being to process more deeply in layers and methodologies of their being, which are not just their rational mind working in overdrive in isolation. So I would not be comfortable allowing centering prayer to be even remotely construed as an esoteric practice. It's a gateway exoteric practice. And I think what I was really trying to say there, or what I would say now at any point, is that as you begin that practice, what it actually tends to do is trickle back outward to strengthen attention and power in the already external practices. I mean, people will get quieter and pay better attention in church. Their attention will be less scrambled. The Eucharist will be more meaningful. The singing will tend to be more heartfelt because people are understanding that the call is to engage with a deeper level of their being presence. But until they've tasted what that deeper level is, it's just like telling them to, flap their wings and fly to the ocean. You just can't do it until you have some taste of it.
Got it. So it sounds like you're saying that an introduction of centering prayer as a baseline practice could enrich congregational life, not as just yet another add-on program, but perhaps as the heart of what a faith community is doing.
Altering where the pendulum comes to rest when it stops swinging. And I think it's really unconscionable that meditation is not taught as standard practice, honored for all years in seminaries. any seminaries. Claremont is one striking exception because of some very, very good work going on there. But most people, when they think about the of passing on the legacy of the churches, the practices, they think in terms of the liturgy, the right words for the Eucharist, the biblical study, the sermons, but they don't mess with what we're really talking about, what Jesus was talking about in those Beatitudes, altering the fundamental hardwiring of our perception to a more deep, grounded, integrated, prayerful, respectful wisdom place. And nothing is taught that teaches people how to actually do that. And so, of course, you have nothing to pass on if you haven't been formed in it. And so the practices seem, I think, really, properly so, scary and off-putting to a lot of people who are seminary trained because they didn't get introduced to it in seminary. It's not part of the tradition of their church as they know it. The people who come in to teach it troop in being credentialed in these kind of lay organizations, learning these cookie cutter speeches that they have to give word for word perfect. It just feels sort of honky. And so there's a drawing back from something which is actually natural and our birthright.
Yes, I noticed with my own daughter as she moved from public elementary school to a private middle school that she received a scholarship for, that they have a simple, sort of non-sectarian meditation practice at the beginning of each day. And I've noticed the change in her. I've noticed how much more centered she seems and more joyful.
Great. I've got a friend in Hong Kong who's actually successfully instituted a wisdom curriculum across the high school at Hong Kong International School because they realized that the kids were just getting strung out and stressed out and crazy, and they had no ground. They were getting all this knowledge, but no place to connect it to. And so his wisdom way of teaching, as he calls it, is already a curriculum and will shortly be a book, which I'm greatly looking forward to the emergence of.
Wow.
So I think that the changes are coming, but until we change the heart of things, you can't just keep rearranging the surface.
Yeah. And so you grew up in a Quaker school, and when I was in college, I participated in an unprogrammed Quaker meeting for a little while. There was spacious time for silence. And I feel like oftentimes in our mainline Protestant churches and even Catholic churches, there might be like a bite-sized sample size of silence, not unlike little communion wafers and cups that are in some denominations. Is there any kind of happy medium where actual silence could be meaningfully incorporated in the regular worship gathering, even if it doesn't predominate?
Well, again, I think the question is wrongly framed because silence is not something you import into a service. Silence is something that is the ground from which languaging and speaking emerges. And if people are patterned and habituated in that silence, if they really know how to do it, even their speaking will be silent. Because it will come out of a deeper depth. And it's not a matter of finding places to sort of shoehorn it apart and dump in 5 minutes of silence, like after the sermon or something like that. It's a matter of really letting that different quality of attention pervade everything so that actions are done with more dignity, more spaciousness, less franticness. That's what introducing silence into a service means. It doesn't mean adding it on like a doodad. And I've been in many Quaker meetings where nothing was spoken at all. The whole thing was silence, because silence is not just the backdrop until somebody finally gets up and has something to say. It's the mode in which the hearts are gathered at a really deep level. And any outspeaking that falls into words will fall out of that place. But it's much better to have the silence and no words than the words and no silence.
Yeah. That's something to chew on. It sounds like you're speaking more of a form of inner composure, inner silence that may or may not be accompanied with outer silence.
Yep.
Got it. Okay.
And of course, that's what you learn, Mike, when you start messing around in these monastic circles that you referred to, and particularly when you go to places like Bhutan and hang out with the Buddhists there for a while. You learn what the depths of silence and the bearing and the gait and the pace of real contemplative worship is like. And then you just grit your teeth and cringe at what, we've been willing to settle for is religion and celebration in the institutional churches.
Hmm. We're so wound up and frenetic, aren't we?
Exactly.
Well, this is as good a segue as any to talking about another anthology that you've not only contributed to, but it's the entire anthology. It's called Love is the Answer, What is the Question? And it's a collection of your online writing. Yes, from 2016 to 2018, selected writings and talks. And what strikes me about this is that, I've been in sort of centering prayer and contemplative circles of one flavor or another for about 20 years now. And most of the time, a lot of folks approach centering prayer as a very therapeutic practice. It's sort of siloed, it's apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
And in your collection of essays, you directly engage some really pressing matters of this era. You kind of go toe to toe with your friend and colleague Ken Wilber, responding to his essay "Trump in a Post-Truth World" and looking at what an integral politics looks like.
Yeah.
You tackle the thorny question of abortion from several different angles, looking at women's rights and the deeply held convictions of conscience of people of faith, and ultimately begin exploring it from a matter of consciousness itself in a way that I've never seen before. So before we get in the weeds of any particular essay in here, I'm wondering how, for you, your application of composure, of life suffused with silence, has you writing differently than a lot of contemplative speakers and communicators that I'm aware of.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I think that what we've gotten in our recent transmission, as one of those sort of inevitable half-truths that come up when you take something that was once sort of very subtle and closely guarded and put it out in a more popular way, you get reductionistic takes. And one of them is that contemplation is about resting in God. This is the enormous popular spin that Thomas Keating put on it back 20 years ago when he was launching the movement of centering prayer. And he quotes directly from Pope Gregory the Great to do this back in the 7th century. But he doesn't quote the whole quote. And contemplation is not in the classic Christian or luminous or Western mystical tradition primarily about resting. It's about beholding. It all talks about a luminous vision or knowledge. Knowledge impregnated by love is how John Chrysostom calls it in the 6th, 7th century. It's about a seeing, but it's a seeing that doesn't come with the middle eye. And it doesn't even come in that kind of more yang and out there way of visions and messages and prophetic oracles. It comes in a deeper interior knowingness that is already, when it knows, it's the heart pressing outward to act. It's like the way Abraham knew when he started walking toward his new land that the Lord was leading him to. He didn't know where he was going, but it's a deeper knowing. And the contemplation and the practices supporting it were originally intended to bring people to that kind of knowingness. And of course, the part where centering prayer and Thomas Keating and everybody was quite right is that before you can have even a hope of beginning to access that knowing, you have to pull the plug on the mental chatter. And so that part is exactly true. But what I've been very much about is the recovery of contemplation as a mode of luminous seeing, and also to recover it in its prophetic and collective aspects. that the way it was popularized in the 80s, you're right, is it was quite siloed and it was hooked up with a whole therapeutic nomenclature. So I go in and I do my centering prayer and I unload my little false self and dismantle all my emotional programs for happiness. And pretty soon, what emerges as my true self is my enlightened ego. And it's not, it starts in the right way, but it only brings you to the threshold of the beginning of the journey. And to think that working on your psychological stuff is contemplative transfiguration is simply a delusion. And so what I felt very strongly is that the real contemplatives of our time do speak, and they speak from a different place. Jesus spoke to the issues of his time. Teilhard de Chardin spoke to the issues of his time. Thomas Merton spoke to the issues of his time. But you speak not out of the judgment and the self-righteousness and the vindication and the moral high ground that sort of infests and infects the church. You speak from a place of deep compassion, from a place of deep responsibility to uphold the sinews of this planet.
So if I'm hearing you, Cynthia, this reminds me of something that I also first encountered in your teaching, where perhaps we're shifting from a paradigm where we see the end of contemplative living as union with God, as though that were something that we moved from not experiencing to experiencing, or not being true to being true, to unitive seeing. A way of seeing all reality from a different vantage point, an interconnected vantage point. And so for you as a contemplative, you are free to weigh in on and speak on any of the matters that contemporary people are concerned with. But it sounds like you're suggesting that we do so from a more grounded place and a more spacious place.
Exactly. That in a non-judgmental place. It's funny how the Quakers always, very frequently, would just hit it right on the nail head there again, with speaking truth to power as something that had to be done, but had to be done from a place of love and not from a place of moral superiority and judgment. Because we see the tragic backlash in our own culture when people try to grab the moral high ground out from under each other like it was a football or a tug of war, and they just pile up hatred. It has to be done out of deep respect for the earth, for every human and sentient inhabitant of it, and of the legitimacy of other viewpoints. And when it's done for anything short of that, it's just going to create violence in its wake, which is, I think, part of what we've been seeing here. So, in other words, we got both arms of the dilemma are not okay. It's not okay for contemplation to be an excuse for silo behavior, and it's not okay to not speak truth to power, but it's not okay to just sort of run rampant in moral urgency and violence and condemnation, which put as much toxicity into the planet as they're trying to remove. So I think it's the wise contemplative heart that can kind of dance through the raindrops on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we have no time to go into this today, but if you're tuning in and you're curious about what this perspective might look like, Cynthia addresses this in detail in her book, The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three. There's this law of three, which again, I doubt we'd even have time to touch the surface on today in our remaining time, but it's a way of, I experience it as practical non-duality, a practical way to honor that everything belongs and that I still at the same time have agency and I still have things that I wish to be changed in the world. And it's about entering into a process that in some ways is beyond the Hebrew prophetic paradigm of always just railing against power and moving into something that is truly a win-win-win scenario for all parties concerned.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. I mean, usually we think of the alternative to non-duality as oneness, but you might say the alternative is threeness.
Indeed.
Anything to get you out of two.
Right, exactly. Well,
Terrible truths, remember?
Well, so, there's all kinds of wonderful essays, and love is the answer. What is the question? I wonder if in our last few minutes here we can focus on one of the final ones, which was titled "Where We Come From."
Mm-hmm.
Because I think part of what makes your teaching and your approach unique is that, yes, you draw on a Benedictine Catholic monastic stream, like so many beautiful contemplative teachers today do, but that's not the only stream you draw on. And in this short essay, you name a few other streams, including that of the Gurdjieff work and that of Ken Wilber and developmental modeling. And so, especially for those of you tuning in who this isn't your first time at the contemplative rodeo, you might be interested to hear more about these other streams that Cynthia draws from, that inspires her work and those of us who have been practicing in this vein.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Gurdjieff piece is the big piece that sort of makes me the oddball out in the Christian contemplative audience. It's the one thing I bring that, as you correctly say, most of the others don't bring. And I spent, almost a decade of very active practice with a fourth way group, as they're called, in Canada, and the perspectives that it brings on the real meaning and purpose of the human being, how we actually work to shift things inside us, and how we actually move in the world skillfully, as well as things like the understanding of the Trinity as part of as a mandala of the law of three. Gurdjieff really taught me to work phenomenologically with the processes of the world rather than just theologically, and to own the responsibility for being present before you could do almost anything that required conscious presence. So it's a very, very important piece. The other piece which figures really prominently in my own work, and it's, again, not typical in a lot of my other mystic cohorts, is the fellows who are sort of at the esoteric end of the cosmological spectrum, Jacob Burma and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who are cosmologists or cosmosophists, if you want to call them, in the great mystical sense of keeping a watchful eye on the planet. And I think that it was both of those guys that gave me the courage and the platform to begin to look at things more from the level of layers of consciousness. I'm careful with Ken Wilber's material. I find that he's got a lot of extremely useful and clarifying tools that just sort of like the old cow's scalpel that cuts right through a lot of kind of conundrums and crap. But it's very, very possible to wander into his scenarios, and that I find that his kind of still sort of classically Eastern Buddhist Hindu perspective does not always mesh as well as possible with the very mystical and Trinitarian Christian reference points that I think have a deep validity, not always measured in his mega maps of the world. So I pick and choose amongst the Wilbur stuff, and I know that people that work in our lineage will be responsible for knowing about 4 or 5 tricks in the Ken Wilber grab bag and knowing them very, very well. but that the rest of it I just don't wander into too much because it's a world of its own.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that one of the shortcomings of Ken's work is that he elevates the impersonal as the highest level, and that personality, personhood, at the end of the day, doesn't seem to have much of a place in his ladder of consciousness?
Well, it kind of depends on what level of Ken you're reading. And one of the things that makes Ken interesting is that he's constantly growing and he's constantly rewriting and revising. And I think he had a big breakthrough, which got recorded at least the first time I really saw it, in his 1996 book on, or was it 2006, Integral Spirituality, where he talks about the 1, 2, and 3 of spirit, and how the biggest singular lacking thing in the world today is the I-thou relationship, the personal.
That's true, yeah.
And it's quite true that he started from these very Eastern models, which see the personal, they get it all confused with the emotional, and therefore sort of assign it to a lower order place on the scale of being. But I think when you really start reading Teilhard and people like that, where the personal really means the deep capacity to live in a relational universe, and anything that's relational is personal, that I think Ken is moving towards that understanding, and he's moving toward a powerful understanding of how it's through the personal that heart is generated and devotion is generated and the fire is generated that actually puts people through the eye of the needle and into an authentic non-dual, which is not just a mental exercise, but a fusion of mind and heart. So I would say that the bottom line, the last word is not in on where Ken will wind up with that. But
Sure.
I won't be the first to know, I can guarantee you that. Thomas Keating used to be my Ken Wilber spy, but now that Thomas has left this mortal coil, I don't know who my spy will be.
Well, if you're watching this and you are in Ken's inner circle, you know who to contact.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so there's one of your tenets in the "Where We Come From" essay that I want to read, because I think it's a great segue to our final piece here about how folks can begin to incorporate lived wisdom in their everyday lives. You say in number 6 of "Where We Come From," we are moving steadily in the direction of revisioning contemplation, no longer in terms of monastic, otherworldly models, prioritizing silence and repose, but rather as a way of honing consciousness and compassion so as to be able to fully engage the world and become active participants in its transition to the higher collectivity, the next evolutionary unfolding. Now we've already talked a little bit about this and how you see this emphasis being different, but if you gave yourself permission to dream, what would you like to see unfolding in the coming decades with regards to this, engaging in this collective transition?
Well, I think that one of the things that I'd like to see happening would be, of course, a rebirthing and revisioning of monasteries that, as far as I know, are mostly on this country in their dying generation here. And I think the way that that's going to happen, and the only way it's going to happen, is if they consciously move towards a more intentionally ashram status, where they realize they're sharing their tradition with others who will come for a while and then move on. And I would love to see the release from old patriarchal top-down monological models, the much greater participation in the actual developing and the creating of the modality of people of color, of people of other other ethnicities, people who live beneath the equator. In other words, that if we move globally towards seeing contemplation as one of the human treasures to be owned to make our world really human, and to work at it that way. That's where Thomas Keating was going very profoundly toward the end of his life. And I would really see that it's a little bit following in the footsteps of where he was pointing towards a two-way street, towards a increasing separation of what we call contemplation from external conditions that prioritize being very, very quiet and wearing fancy robes, and that really allow us to see that until we're present in the world and almost invisible sort of in the world, sort of what do they call it, camouflaged in the outer world and visible only by the quality of our being. Then, when we can do that, then we really become skillful infiltrators and saboteurs, and then we're going to see people on the seats of posts in high positions, presidents of United States and Supreme Court justices and others that are actual contemplatives and are doing the work of becoming conscious human beings. And that's what I think is going to be the ultimate salvation of our world. Not that we take them all off and put them in a little private space called monasteries, but that they filter back in as powerful, luminous threshing floors transformation.
Wow. Dare we hope that our world leaders could become contemplatives. And it sounds like for you, that could come from a sort of creating open source wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that you've done throughout your vocation, kind of bringing these treasures that were previously behind closed doors, but at least since Thomas Merton's time have become increasingly open to the public. And I want to share a little bit about one way that I see this sort of open sourcing or democratization of wisdom happening next with you. And that's through the introductory wisdom school, which is now available online. In previous years, if you want to attend a Cynthia Bourgeault retreat, good luck. There's usually a waiting list. It can usually be quite challenging. And it's a very in-demand and intense container where, like all retreats and like monastic life itself, it's a kind of sequestering away from your everyday and dedicating specific time to perhaps acquire new skills, new perspectives. And those kinds of sequester times are really valuable. But what I've experienced through working through some of your online wisdom course, which I was there for the actual retreat that was filmed live. But what I appreciate about taking the online course is that it gives me the opportunity to actually integrate it side by side with my daily lived conditions. That I don't have the luxury of being away from my family, away from my children, away from my work. But I do take a certain amount of time to perhaps watch one of the sessions, look at one of the practices, do one of the practices, and I get to see kind of real time with my life as a laboratory how that will interact with my daily conditions. So I say all that to say I'm a big fan of the online wisdom course, and I'm wondering, Cynthia, if you have anything to add to that.
Well, my profound debt of gratitude to Robin Whittington, who put the whole thing together. It was her brilliant idea. She filmed it. She edited it with the help of a team. Has been marketing it, and it really has allowed people all over the world who could not get into wisdom schools because the waiting line was too long, or because they couldn't come break loose from obligations, or couldn't afford it, or any of those couldn'ts. It gives them access, and I've seen lots of groups form where people will hunker down in formats like this book club and start learning wisdom together. So it's really taken a major step forward in the as you say, the democratization of what were used to be inner resources and only transmitted one-on-one. And I think it's been, you can never tell. I mean, it's always glorious, as you said, to be able to do things in the intimacy and the energetic intensity of one-on-one. But in a world where the technology is just opening up for us new ways of being together that we could never even conceive of before. This is also making it possible to widely disseminate some ideas that are new old ideas and that haven't been sufficiently honored and passed on in the mainstream cultural institutions of our time, or spiritual institutions of our time, which is one reason we're in such a terrible mess right now out in our political scene, that we just don't have the tools and the vision and the depth that we need to really behave like fully responsible human beings. So the material's available, and I would just say have at it.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you want to have at it, you can go to courses.wisdomwayofknowing.org. And normally this course, which I want to say, goodness, is probably like at least 15 hours worth of material, if I'm not mistaken, plus like a 200 plus page full color workbook that traces out everything in a really beautiful way. I've actually spoken to Robin and suggested you ought to get this published as like a standalone piece, because it stands by itself and it's awesome. But normally this is $347, I believe. But right now, during this season, it's available for $150 off. So if you go on to courses.wisdomwayofknowing.org and you enter contemplative campfire as the discount code, contemplative campfire, you will receive that $150 off. on the course. And there's a link here in the notes for this video dialogue as well. So, well, thank you so much, Cynthia, for joining us, for sharing with us about why panentheism doesn't quite fit, but this cosmotheandric interbeing does, for sharing why, as contemplatives, we do get to speak into the everyday world of life and concerns, but hopefully from an elevated place, and for sharing with us how some first steps that we might take, or some next steps we might take in living from the heart of wisdom today.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.